Hello, and welcome to Scott's Odyssey. In the mid-1700s, there were two well-known astronomers who were sought after for their ability to match a series of points in the stars with a single point on terra firma. As a matter of fact, these two astronomers were so good at what they did that they teamed up to help with some border disputes in the colonies. And here we are, at a site that was established back in January 1764 as the star-based demarcation point to use for reference while determining where a property line was. Welcome to the site of the Stargazers Stone. See you in a minute. Welcome back. If you've watched my videos before, thank you for your patronage, and if you're new to Scott's Odyssey, welcome aboard. The time period was the 1730s, and a war broke out in the Conejohalla Valley between the Calvert family who founded Maryland and the Penn family who founded Pennsylvania, all over a border dispute. The war became known as the Conejocular War, deriving its name from, well, Conejohalla. It is also more commonly referred to in Maryland and some southern states as Creesap's War. Thomas Creesap was an agent for Lord Baltimore in 1720s, and well, because we are not here to tell his story, let's jump to the fact that at one point he moved to Conejohalla Valley, well within the Susquehanna River path, pissed off a shit ton of locals by declaring the area to be of Maryland instead of Pennsylvania, and without any education whatsoever, declared himself a land surveyor to Lord Baltimore and extended the northern and western boundary of Maryland, literally increasing the size of Maryland by 1/3 of its original size to include even the city of Philadelphia. The Pennamites of Pennsylvania disagreed. What's that? What is a Pennamite? Well, if you're from Pennsylvania, you should probably be a little embarrassed to ask that question, but regardless, it has become an all too common mistake due to this new generation of people who think they can just change words' meanings because they were indoctrinated by a scholastic system that keeps them at a perpetual third grade level. But I digress. If you are born in, live in, or associate with Pennsylvania as a citizen, denizen, or patriot, then you are not a Pennsylvanian, you are a Pennamite. Yes, that is correct. Pennsylvanian is not what people of Pennsylvania are called. They are called Pennamites. Now, if you have a history or a subject matter or a location or even a culture that is within Pennsylvania, that is called Pennsylvanian. Back to the story. When this disagreement of Creesap's claims on behalf of the Lord of Baltimore was brought to the attention of the Crown, both colonies were told to work it out politely. This act and these claims, along with an accusation of murder, made Creesap a criminal fugitive to the colony of Pennsylvania. When Creesap was taken into custody by Pennsylvanian Pennamites and his house was burned to the ground, Maryland again petitioned King George to intervene and settle the boundary dispute. This land dispute did truly turn into a full-fledged war that was extremely violent, with a significant loss of life and a lot of plantation burning and destruction all around. The conflict lasted for 50 years, and the violent war lasted for the last 8 of those 50 years. Now, there was never a formal declaration of war between the colonies, but it did not stop the violence and the attacks from one to the other through perpetuating skirmishes. We're talking about well above the historically famed property line conflict of the Hatfields and McCoys. It was bad. The Calvert and Penn families got together and drafted a peace treaty in 1738. In it, they stated they agreed to a border approximately 15 miles south of Philadelphia, stating they sought to not permit or suffer any more tumults or riots or other outrageous disorders to be committed on the borders of their respective provinces. The King's Court made the agreement binding in 1750 and declared that the border was found approximately 30 degrees and 40 minutes north. Well, as we Pennamites here in Pennsylvania know, an approximation of a border of any piece of property is not very binding and will, to this day, lead to direct land disputes that can get very hot very quickly. So what ended up happening was a discussion to have surveyors officially establish the demarcation point, 17 years after the King's Court's decision. The Calverts and Penns agreed to hire surveyors for the boundary dispute, and in the year 1763, the work began for declaring the official, unquestionable line of demarcation between Maryland and Pennsylvania. Onto the drawing a line in the sand stone. It was late fall in 1763 when Charles Mason, an English astronomer, a member of the Royal Observatory, was living in Philadelphia providing astronomical information back to England of what was seen from this side of the pond, as well as heavily contributing documentation to the record of American history. He was seeking to provide as much service to the Crown as possible with his skill sets. One person with whom Charles often talked to was a friend by the name of John Bird, another astronomer who was also an active fellow of the Royal Society, and in a letter recommended, "Charles, you should bring on an assistant by the name of Jeremiah Dixon, who was a professional surveyor and a part-time astronomer." Both Charles and Jeremiah set up their base for this project at the Harlan House farm owned by George Harlan, not to be confused with his son Joshua Harlan's still standing Harlan log cabin just 8 miles down the road from here. And this is where they spent the next 4 years, plotting and surveying the borders of the two provinces. Just 700 feet north of the location that the Harlan House once stood is where the two men established what has become known as Stargazers Stone. The stone marks what was intended to be a temporary site of observation of the stars to make determination on the precise latitude just 31 miles from the already well-established and former southernmost point of Philadelphia. From this point, Pennsylvania-Maryland border would be exactly 15 miles south of the Philadelphia point. You may have noticed that I've given you distances measured by British scientists in both feet and miles, and not meters nor kilometers. There's a reason for that. You see, we here in the United States use a measurement system that originated back in the time we are referencing. The same measurement system that was used by the British, because we too, at this time, were British. The system of measurement is called the imperial system of measurement. What's that? I should be using meters and kilometers because the British are on the metric system? Well, you should really learn more about history. You see, the metric system was not invented until 1795, and that was in France, not one of Britain's better friends. So aside from the fact that the metric system was not yet invented, it was also invented in a hostile nation and ultimately would not become the measurement system of Britain until 1965. And for those of you who think that the imperial system is weaker than the metric system, well, it did not stop us from getting to the moon first, nor has the base unit of measurement changed in 463 years, as opposed to the metric system, which has changed its base unit of measurement 47 times since 1795, with the most recent changes in the past 3 years, redefining 4 of the 7 base units yet again. So how are you supposed to measure something if 1 nanometer from 2019 is not the same as 1 nanometer from 2021? When performing the work for the survey, Charles Mason had brought with him the latest and greatest tools ever used for surveying and astronomy. His tools included a zenith sector telescope built by John Bird, which could measure latitude and equal altitude in transit, essentially the very first usable theodolite, which is still used today in many surveying applications. To account for longitudinal measurements, they used a chronometer, which was built by John Harrison and now is a common instrument in longitude measurements. But it should be duly noted that Charles preferred to measure his longitude through lunar distance. The contract was to perform the following tasks. First, they had to settle the latitude of the southernmost point of the city of Philadelphia. Then they had to find a point 30 to 35 miles west of that point on the same latitude. Finally, they had to measure a line horizontally due south, observing the latitude of the southern end of the original line, and proceed to run parallel of the latitude through this last point, marking the northern boundary of Maryland and the southern boundary of Pennsylvania. On January 6th of 1764, they completed the first step using an observatory that is no longer in existence at the Huddle Plumstead House on Cedar Street in Philadelphia. A specific note, if you decide to go looking for this location, realize that Cedar Street of the original Penn City grid map is now the more than infamous South Street. Now, you'd think it would have been an easy straight shot from this point, just 15 miles south in order to kick off the next step. But unfortunately, there was a river in the way. And not just any little river, but the Delaware River. And not just some small little inconvenience, but due to the shape and turns of the Delaware River, it was severely in the way of measurements on 2 separate occasions. So Charles realized the political issues of if he moved the next measuring point into New Jersey. So did something interesting and moved their measuring point to the west, somewhere along the Brandywine. He even journaled that on January 7th, we set out from Philadelphia with a quadrant to find a place in the forks of Brandywine, having the same parallel as the southernmost point of the city of Philadelphia. After finding a location, they moved their observatory on the 11th to the new location, describing the delicate nature of transporting the equipment, stating it was carried on the springs with featherbed under it of a single horse chair. At this point, both Charles and Jeremiah were trusting marks made by surveyors from New Jersey in 1736 and used the 8 stars to establish their latitude at the Stargazers Stone. Now, the use of the phrase 8 stars is often heard of as if there were 8 specific stars or a cluster of 8 stars used for mapping and surveying. The reality is that at this time it was considered the highest form of accuracy if you chose 8 specific stars above and 8 specific stars below your zenith, or the location that is directly above your observation point. The first measurements were taken in February. The second and third measurements were taken in May and June respectively, all from the Stargazers Stone. From the information observed and recorded, they were able to establish what officially became known as postmarked west, giving a southernmost point of demarcation at which they knew exactly where the Maryland-Pennsylvania border would be due west of that point. On October 18th of 1767, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon completed their survey of the 233-mile border and turned over their information to the Calverts and Penns, thereby officially establishing what we now call the Mason Dixon Line. Now, some other pieces of information that you may find interesting about this. The original Quaker family that owned the Harlan House were so honored that their farm was used to make the determination of the border between the 2 provinces that they kept the Stargazers Stone in place. The Harlan family lived in the house on the property until 1956, and through the 189 years they owned the property, they always took care to preserve the location of the Stargazers Stone. At one point, this location became part of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which operated an almshouse or poorhouse on the property. Although the building is no longer there, the Potter's Field, or the cemetery where you buried the poor people of the almshouse, still remains. The property then expanded into a 17,000-acre area and went on to be owned and operated by King Ranch as the world's largest importer and exporter of cattle. At some point, the property fell out of King Ranch's hands and landed squarely in Chester County's hands, and unfortunately, they didn't have a means to manage it. So through a land grant donation from the Lenfest Foundation in 2007, the property was turned into what is now called Chen Les Preserve, a name derived from Chester County and Lenfest Foundation, and is open to the public. I hope you liked this video on the Stargazer Stone, and if you have other suggestions for ODDySEEy sites and stories of who we once were, leave me a comment below. Remember to give me a like, hit the subscribe, click the bell for notifications of new video releases. As always, I sincerely thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.